Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growth Stage, a podcast by FastBrain, where we discuss how digital product companies grow revenue, build meaningful products, and increase the value of their business. I'm your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the digital product community as part of my role at FastSpring, and I love bringing the best of the community to you here on the Growth Stage podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about developing a winning KPI strategy for game marketing. And joining us for that conversation is someone who knows quite a bit about that. From Gamesight, I would like to welcome Adam Lieb. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me, David.
So glad that you're here. I'm so interested in this topic. And for those who are listening and watching, what Adam's going to share today are his thoughts on why game marketing is so complex to begin with, what KPI you can use to help cut through the noise and focus on what matters most, and key strategies to use when interpreting your KPI. Sometimes we look at our KPI and don't know what we're seeing. So I think these are really interesting topics, and I'm really curious to get your perspective, Adam, coming from Gamesight and all the data and strategies that you see with your customers. So before we kick it off into the subject matter, Adam, I wanted to start with a question I often ask, which is, what was the first game or in-game item you bought with your own money? Not like a gift, but like it was Adam's money.
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably bought my first game with my own money when I was 8. I was into games enough that I was, saving up my money to buy my own games at that age. So let's see. I can do some quick math. When I was 8 years old, what games would have been like the sort of the hot ones. I don't have a specific memory, but it's probably something like, it's probably a Final Fantasy game, maybe Final Fantasy 3 on SNES. It's probably something like that that I could remember saving up for. When I was a kid, it was great because we still we had Blockbuster. You'd go to Blockbuster and you'd rent a game and you'd have that game to play for the weekend. So it was kind of the as a young kid during those days, it was sort of rare that you bought a game, right? That it was like worth buying and owning the game versus the whatever it was, $3 or $4 rental that you'd have for the weekend. But there was a few that definitely stood out. So yeah, I'll guess that it was Final Fantasy 3 on SNES.
I like the Blockbuster rental reference. That's such an interesting one. I think for me, it would have been a quarter in an arcade machine if I really thought about it. But that's pretty impressive, Final Fantasy for an 8-year-old. So.
I always loved JRPGs and captured me very young for sure.
Excellent. All right. Well, could you tell me a little bit about what Gamesight does and what you do there?
Yeah, sure. Gamesight is we make publishing tools and marketing tools for video game companies. We primarily work with PC and console game developers. We have a bunch of different parts of our business. I think that probably most germane to this conversation would be our measurement platform, where we provide marketing attribution and measurement for pretty much all digital marketing. It's the most used product in market for PC console games. And so through that lens, we are working with many companies to help measure the billions of dollars they're spending to reach gamers and grow their games. And yeah, definitely through that lens, we spend a lot of time talking about KPIs and numbers and metrics and what are the right ones and what are the ones that are wasting everyone's time and what are the ones that confuse everyone that mean nothing. So it's definitely an interesting topic, and one where I like it because there's no answer. Like there's no one, it's this, everyone knows you just use this one number and your whole life is easy. It's like, it doesn't work that way. I wish it worked that way, but it doesn't work that way. So we definitely talk about at least the useful tactics that I see for looking at your business and trying to understand your game and how it is growing or how it could grow.
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of complexity in the way you described that. You talked about different platforms the game might be on. You talked about different marketing tactics and how you're attributing amongst all these different elements. And I think just marketers in general are overwhelmed with the amount of data available to them and where do they focus their time. So with that, kind of flood of information and possibilities, why is having a core set of KPI important to you? Why not just go off on these magic data adventures all the time?
Yeah, I think the best answer for that is because people won't understand it. So even if it's the right number and you're right about how you calculated it and you pulled the data correctly, even if everything was right, if people don't understand it, it doesn't basically doesn't matter if you can't get your whole team on board, your partners, your vendors. If everyone's sort of not understanding what we're talking about, then it doesn't really matter if you're right. And I think that's just the sort of this unique, the unique facet of this type of problem, where like being right isn't what matters, but being understood often is the thing that matters. And I think that's where I just it's hard for certain, and I'm the type of person it's hard for me too, because I want to find this sort of like ground truth. What is the right answer? But sometimes it's not the right answer. It's what's the most useful answer. And certainly the complexity of games distribution has changed a lot. You know, and when I bought Final Fantasy III, they sold it one way. They shipped it to stores like Best Buy or GameStop or whatever, and people bought it. And so Square's job, Nintendo's job, was to get distribution and make sure that stores carried their games. And as long as they did, you know, everything else after that, like, sort of didn't matter so much. And I think that's a very, very different world that we live in now, where games are available on. Certainly, they're still sold in stores. You can go buy one. You still go buy the new Final Fantasy game. They still sell the box version of Final Fantasy 16. That's where the minority of sales are. Majority are digital, and they're going to be digital on different platforms, on PC, on console, various streaming services. I think that's certainly a huge challenge. It's just games are distributed in a bunch of different places, so figuring out where they are and what's working and how to track that is hard. But then also the business model of games different, right? Yeah, Final Fantasy 3, it was it was probably $40. I don't actually know what in that time of life what a game costs, but my guess is it's like $40 is probably what we paid for Final Fantasy 3, something like that. Everyone paid the same price. That's what the game cost, and there was no way to pay any more or less for it. It was $40 game. I guess you could rent it at Blockbuster.
Get in a clearance bin at some point or something.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But from the publisher's perspective, they don't care about that, right? Because their job was to sell it to Best Buy, and then what Best Buy does with it later is it's a sort of secondary problem. So I think that's changed a lot. Certainly, you can still buy the games that way, but most games now, especially big AAA games, they're going to have some sort of subscription service, DLCs, secondary parts of the product that you can buy. Obviously, there's in-game currencies, and free-to-play games is kind of a whole other thing. But the different ways you can give games money has just like gone through the roof. There's a lot of ways to do it, and some games employ a few of those tactics, some employ all of them. And so again, picking what's the number that matters can be really challenging. I didn't work in games marketing in 1992, but if I did, my guess is they broadly looked at marketing as you kind of take the marketing budget, you take the game sales budget, you divide one by the other, and you broadly have your efficiency. Like, we spent this amount of money, and to make the game, we spent this much money marketing it. We divide it by how much revenue we got, and hopefully everyone's excited, or we lost a ton of money. Let's not do that again. It just doesn't work that way anymore. And so figuring out how to calculate and make decisions is a whole lot different than it used to be.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the core set of KPI and hear you put so much importance into the narrative that it tells within your organization. I'm guessing to your investors and others, and do they understand it? And I'm guessing also, is it also a meaningful reflection of success? I think it's such an important way to think about KPIs, like what is the story it's telling? And it also sounded a little bit like you felt your core set of KPI probably isn't where you're doing your deep analysis. Maybe it's more like a scorecard or like a health type view that tells a story. Is that a fair interpretation, Adam?
Yeah, there's definitely different, I don't think I've ever seen like one number to rule them all, where you can just look at that and it tells you everything you need to know. But for sure, there are some KPIs that are, I think, good health checks of whatever you're checking. The business, the marketing, growth, whatever you're specifically trying to judge. Where there's a number, and it's consistent. I would say those numbers need to be easy to calculate, and then you start getting into the more sort of like diagnostic numbers, where you say, okay, well, this number maybe isn't so good. Well, now let's go one layer deeper, and then you can have a sort of another set of numbers that you're analyzing. So I don't think either works. I don't think you can have, okay, we have 37 KPIs, let's monitor them all every day and see how we're doing. Also, don't think you can have one that says, okay, well, this is it. And companies have tried that for a long time, and I say that's probably what you see the most on the internet. It's like, oh, just focus on your ARPU or ARPU, or it's all about CPI. And it's like, sure, these are all important numbers. Not to say that like you shouldn't care about them. But that number alone doesn't tell you everything you need to know. It's probably a good health check. If you're tracking your CPI every day for a year and all of a sudden it starts dipping day over day, week over week, you're okay. Now let's drill in and figure out, what are the numbers underneath that helps us really figure out what's going on. But I'm always leery when people try to tell me that there's one number and that's everything's built around that number. I think they're usually wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So you alluded to this earlier around game marketing being so complex. We talked a little bit about cross-platform, cross-channel, so on and so forth. What's your view? Like, why is it so difficult for game companies to effectively measure and monitor their KPI?
It's probably a bunch of different reasons. I think probably at its core, it's that the more things equals more complexity, right? If you're only selling in one channel, it's not that complex. If you're selling in two channels, it's more. You're selling in 10, it's 10x the complexity. So I think there's just the sheer numbers of it all that make it more number of things, more complexity. And then I think beyond that, you also get into the details and nuances of platforms and the data they share, when they share it. Some platforms, thinking about games distribution platforms specifically, they will report numbers in real-time dashboards. Some of them don't report numbers except for on kind of 30-day audit style reports. Well, that's if you're trying to compare A to B, it's really difficult to do. Some platforms give you different data in some countries than others. Okay, well then, how do I compare my North American sales to my European sales if my North American sales get reported on one basis and maybe with not net of refunds, where my European sales get reported to me net of refunds? Okay, well now I can't compare those two easily. It doesn't mean you can't do anything. It doesn't mean you can't then build a model or change kind of your your analysis to account for, okay, these guys don't do it net of refunds. You can do all that, but every time you do that, you're adding a layer of complexity on top of a number, which keeps stacking up. So now all of a sudden that one number, which maybe was your daily revenue, maybe that sounds like a great number, right? How much money do we make today? Perfectly commonsensical question to ask. But what happens when one platform reports your numbers not net of refunds and the other reports it net of refunds? Well, it becomes really difficult to just look at that number and say that it's the right answer, because maybe you screwed something up in some country and your refund rate is extremely high. Well, now you're actually massively misjudging how successful you were that day. Again, it's all doable. You can always make those changes to either how the number is calculated or your analysis of it. But each time you do, you add complexity.
Yeah, it almost like it exponentially expands, right? By platform and then by marketing strategy, trying to drive value in those platforms. So sounds like you have plenty to do there at Gamesight.
Well, luckily I don't do most of that. That's it's like those are engineering problems by and large, at least from our perspective.
Right.
But I think that's probably why I spend a lot of time thinking about what do the numbers mean more than there's the how you calculate them, which is sort of a core engineering question that we have to answer for our customers. We give them dashboards and they have to have numbers in them, and what those say and why they say them is important. But sort of leaning on my first point of getting to that understanding of how do we make sure that we're all thinking about this the same way and we're all able to communicate this out the same way becomes the pivotal question.
You mentioned earlier, I think this is fair, that each company will kind of have to settle on what their core set is. And I'm sure you've seen this many, many times over and over again with your customers. But is there a common theme? Revenue, maybe? You talked about the complexities in tracking it, but just as a KPI, what are the common ones you think are the most important across the board?
Yeah, I think there's probably three common ones. There's one that's going to be on the cost side, and that'll be calculated differently. But broadly think about that as like a CPI. How much does it cost to bring me new players? There are different numbers that people will use. If it's a free-to-play game, it's how much does it cost me to bring any random person into my game? Is that useful? Probably not. How much does it cost me to bring in a player who plays my game for an hour or completes the tutorial or buys the the first upgrade or whatever? I think that'll be a little bit different for everyone in terms of what you care about when you're thinking about cost. But that's certainly one. How much are we spending to bring players into our ecosystem? I think there's what are they worth, which is really the revenue calculation. If you use my childhood analogy, right? Final Fantasy 3 was a simple one. It was whatever, $40 or whatever it was, sort of net of, the sort of wholesaling piece of it. Fine, maybe it was $20. Every time, they sent a package of Final Fantasy 3 to Best Buy, it was $20 per cartridge they shipped. Easy to calculate, not very complicated. So yeah, what is that kind of a player worth to me? That becomes a very complicated calculation for some games, because the answer might be impossible to calculate on day one, right? The simple, the commonsensical free to play example is someone downloads your game, they play it, they don't spend any money for a month. Well, in month 2, they upgrade, they buy the $100 premium package and season pass and all this and that. Well, for 30 days, you thought this player was worth $0 to you, but instead they actually were worth $100 to you, and that was only in month 2. Well, are they going to make that same $100 purchase next month? Are they going to make it once a year? It becomes this really challenging question to answer. The more historical data you have, the better you can kind of estimate that. But even then, you're sort of those investment commercials you see where they always give you the caveat, past performance is no indication of future returns or something. It's like I always have that thought in my head of like, great, well, last year our average player spent this amount of money. Really doesn't say a lot about what's going to happen a year from now. We can kind of hope that that's the same player profiles and spend profiles, but we don't know. We haven't made the content or shipped the content that people are going to be spending their money on. So you can do estimates, but at the end of the day, that's what they are. They're estimates. So yeah, that becomes a massively complicated number to calculate for many companies, where it used to be a fairly trivial number to calculate because it was like units times dollars equals revenue, period.
Yeah, there's so many factors at play as well, because the new content that's released will influence the amount of revenue you make. So you could have the best marketing in the world and the average revenue goes down because people didn't like the new season or whatever it was.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I think the one that's probably most top of mind for me right now is Elden Ring, right? Game came out 2 years ago, February 2 years ago. It had I think they just announced 25 million units sold to date. New DLC, which is $40, just came out. So for the last 2 years, 25 million people bought the game that were worth roughly $60 to Bandai. That's what probably the average purchase price was. I think there were a couple different tiers, so maybe it's higher than that, but something like that. Somewhere there had to be a calculation of, well, an Elden Ring player is actually worth more to Bandai because we have future content. We're going to make this expansion and it's going to be $40. A bunch of people are going to buy it. But where and how do you build that in when you're spending marketing dollars on launch? And how are you calculating what I think today I saw maybe 5 million units sold so far. So $40 times 5 million, that's 20% of the players basically that have the attach rate on the DLC. That also has boosted the initial game sales. And I don't know that was probably forecasted quite the same way. You knew that people who bought Elden Ring 2 years ago, some of them are going to buy this expansion. But what about players who've been hearing about the Elden Ring for 2 years who are now like, well, this is the time to get in, and now they're buying the base game and the DLC? Again, we can make guesses on these things, but actually, coming up with a realistic calc on that becomes really hard because it's sort of never been done before. As far as I've heard, this might be the highest attach rate of a DLC ever in its like first week, right? Like 20% of players buying a DLC in week 1 is just never happened before. It's early. I don't know. The data will bear out a little bit more, but that's crazy, right? Like it's how do you build these? How do you build KPI and try to make an estimate when something's never happened before?
One of my favorite quotes of finance forecasts is the only thing you can guarantee about your forecast is it will be inaccurate. And it sounds like there's a lot of variables at play. And so this idea of take rate and lifetime value of a player, you can take an informed prediction, but you're really looking in the rearview mirror a lot to see, like, did that informed prediction actually play out? And then I'm guessing using that information to inform the next set. But to your point, it's maybe a bit of tea leaves as you're doing the forecasting sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's got to be. I think that one of the things I'll often encourage my team to do when you kind of can get lost in data is like step back and say, what do you think is going to happen? Like, right, if you're not going to look at any numbers, what does your gut tell you? And then go and look at the data and see, like, are you directionally accurate, or the numbers tell you something really, really different than what kind of makes sense to you? And I think that sometimes can help train you on, like, because the difference between being off by 10 or 20% on some of these things, like, isn't ever going to matter. Like you said, you know that it's going to be wrong. And so how can you figure out if you're in the right realm, right? If you built a calculation that said, we think 1% of players are going to buy this DLC, I think a reasonable expert in the space, like, well, it's going to be higher than that. That seems too low. Like, there's going to be a lot more people than they're going to do that. And maybe if you looked at average DLC attach rates across all games, you would end up with kind of a low number. But this is a different kind of game with a really loyal audience and, but ravenous for new content. The attach rate is going to probably be on that upper tier of anything we've ever seen before. The fact that maybe it broke the top tier, maybe you wouldn't have forecasted that, but you could have looked at, being in that upper bounds.
We've talked a lot about selling games like paper or CPI. We've talked about in-game purchases. We haven't really talked about games monetized through advertising. What do you think the core set of KPI are for those games? Like what stands out as a common choice?
Yeah, I think it's still this. I think there's still the same things. You calculate the numbers differently, but it's still the cost. It's still, what does it cost me to bring in a player? It's still, how much is a player worth to me? And if that's like because they watch ads, then it's like, how many ads does each player watch? How long do they watch them for? What does that do to to retention rates when you show them more ads or fewer ads? So I think the core things you look at are the same. How you calculate them is gonna be really different. But getting kind of in that habit of thinking about the two sides of what does this cost me and what does this cost me and what does it make me, and looking at those two things separately. Of course, you eventually want to tie them together, but yeah, the calculations are always going to be different based on your business model.
I often think of ad frequency and upsells as the balance between suffering and joy, right? You're introducing a little suffering to get a little joy of revenue for yourself, or deliver a little joy of content to your player, if you will. You mentioned how the frequency of ads, of course, could affect take rate and how long people play the game, and not just play time, but like periods of time. Is there a core KPI you've seen helpful there?
I think those ones become really tough because you end up with these problems of averages where like cohorts are so different. And I think the most successful sort of ad monetizing games have a cohort of players for whom watching ads is like really a core part of the game loop. Whatever. You run out of lives, watch an ad, get a new life. And there are some players that I think, to your point, are like, oh, bummer, I have to watch an ad to get the life, and I don't really want to do it. And I think you have others that is just part of how they play the game, and it's not. I don't think they perceive it the same way that you probably do. And if you were to just average out all players, you'd end up with this kind of weird answer of like, oh, on average, players watch this number of ads, but really you get this 1% of players that watch 30 ads a day and are sort of happy with that. You get maybe the other tier of like, I never want to see an ad and I will do anything I can to avoid an ad. And then, the more median player that maybe sees 3 to 5 ads and like they're sort of like can tolerate it that way. So I think really what you want to do is look at each of those cohorts and figure out what is the mean from each of those cohorts, rather than trying to like mean out and do the arithmetic mean of those 3 cohorts, because I think you end up getting these weird answers. And just another one of the many complexities that games have is that gamers are sort of like even in the same game, not all created equal and don't enjoy the game the same way. They're not looking to play it the same way. They're not looking to engage with it the same way. And so looking at the sort of average player like kind of doesn't oftentimes gives you a really weird answer, or definitely not the answer you're looking for. It's another thing we talk a lot about internally, the sort of like, think back to 6th grade or whatever, when you learn about averages, and it's like, well, there's the mean, the median, and the mode. They all mean average. Which one are we talking about here? And what's the most useful way to think about average? I think the people often will look at average as mean, and like, that's really not, I think, useful in games as often as we'd like it to be, considering that's our like default average.
One of my favorite mobile games is a game called White Tiles, and I have a crisis right now with the game.
Okay.
It jams ads like crazy, and the alternative to pay to turn it off is $10 a month. So I'm kind of stuck in between. Like, I don't really want to play that much, but I love the game and I have the ads. Have you seen publishers you've worked with manage through KPI balancing? Like, are you trying to push people to the subscription, or just not make them annoyed enough that they stop playing the game because of the ads? I don't mean to use my own personal experience for this question, but have you seen similar situations where people optimize between the balance between the paid and the ad side, and leverage a specific KPI that stood out to you?
I would say on like the sort of ad specific side, that's not a huge focus of our business. We don't work with a ton of games that are ad supported as their main model, but I do think there's similar there's similar things to look at in other types of games we work with, where there's a free to play tier, and then there's a premium tier, or maybe there's a seasons pass. That there's some games that we work with where I would say the seasons pass is built to be more like a premium tier. It's sort of like if you're a core player of this game, you're sort of expected to, in your experience, will be what you want it to be, as long as you're on that monthly subscription, which is similar to what you're talking about. Sometimes it's $10 a month, sometimes it's $20 for 3 months. They kind of all calculate a little bit differently. And I do think that the best companies that we work with, I would say, often don't think about it the way you just described it. They would think about the reverse, which is they're thinking about value, and they're thinking about, well, what can we provide someone for $10 a month that they're like, cool, I'm happy to jam this button and buy the thing, not how much pain can I, deliver to you such that you will click this button to avoid the pain. Not to say that no one ever does that, but I don't think those are often parts of conversations we are involved in. I think they tend to be much more in the, what can we deliver for $10 a month that feels valuable enough that a million people are going to buy it, which
you want to buy it, not that you're forced to buy it, if you will.
Well, and I think that on the ad side, I think there's a it's sort of a similar thing where it's like, we need to make money. We're not in the charity business, and so like showing ads is how we make money for our game. This is what you're worth, to us in terms of your ad dollars. So if we want to exchange that, if you'd rather just not see ads, this is the value of our game is basically you're already paying for it in terms of eyeballs and watching ads. And I think that's tough to sometimes communicate to the average person playing a free mobile game, is not thinking about the developer's P&L and what it costs them to run the game and what their ad dollars are worth or whatever.
Yeah, it's a really good point, especially from the player's perspective. I mean, I'm a marketer, I get it. Totally, and it makes sense, especially when you're dealing with like player communities and sentiment and whatnot. Earlier, you mentioned that obviously not just focusing on CPI and piecing out is the strategy that you should be looking at. Like, are they, maybe how long they're playing the game after you've driven a player there. Are there any other feature use or gameplay metrics you really like to clue in on that aren't like revenue based?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's probably the hardest one to have a general rule for, because every game is so different. So saying like, I think in sort of mobile free to play, the retention numbers tend to be the ones that people drill on the most. D1, D3, D7, D30, which I think is a great indicator of how much someone likes this game. Are they opening it every day? Are they opening it once a month? Like, how much do they come back to play? For a lot of the games we work with, where they're premium, someone's spending $60 to play the game, maybe upfront, whether they played it on D2, 3, or 7 is not the most meaningful metric. So I think it'll be different for each game. I think that the things that I like to look at that tend to correlate the best with how much people like your game, because at the end of the day, that kind of is what you're trying to figure out. Like, how much does someone like this thing? Because that's going to be the best driver of future spending, whether that's I have a DLC or a season's pass or it's a free to play game, is how much does someone like my game? I think time is a great one. Time played is I think maybe underused, where retention numbers get looked at more. But someone downloads my game, plays it 4 hours today, and whether they play it any minutes tomorrow or not, I probably would think that's a pretty engaged player versus someone who played it for 5 minutes today and 5 minutes tomorrow. Sure, they've retained on day 2, but they didn't put as much time in. So I love looking at time as an indicator of engagement. Certainly there's tutorial completion and progress in game. Every game's going to look a little different as to like what does it look like to get to a certain point. I think for many competitive games or games with any type of sort of PvP, you kind of look at how does someone graduate from whatever the single player mode or the tutorial mode to they've now joined matchmaking for the first time. I think that's a great one. Are you graduating players through learning how to play the game to sort of the full game experience? So looking at what percent of players are reaching that the full game experience, the value you're really trying to deliver. I like that one a lot. Social is another one. Depending on the game, they can be really valuable. Do players join clans? Do they make a friend in game? Do they, whatever the social elements exist in the game? Once you're tethering people into a social experience, they are way more likely to stick around and have fun and enjoy your game. So that's
so. If I'm using this as a signal and I'm marketing in various marketing channels, and I get a hit where the social element is really hot, you're kind of implying I would consider that channel more valuable, even if the channel had the same number of players but didn't have the social element to it. You might value that more because of the social aspect of people referring each other. Is that fair?
It's a number of things. It's definitely that referral piece. I think a lot of it is if you have an older game, you'll be able to calculate this yourself. I think I'm imagining for a new game where you don't have this sort of longitudinal data and you're trying to look at these early numbers and figure out what's working, where I should be investing, and what channels and stuff are valuable. Then I think you really care about social, because I think those will over time will prove out to be players that retain, players that stick around in your game. Once they're sort of engaged with other people, it's difficult to churn out. The number of people I know who will still say they sort of play World of Warcraft because of like the friends they have in the game, not so much because of the game itself. World of Warcraft doesn't make them come back; their clan does. So I think those are pretty well proven engagement and kind of retention tactics that games employ. So yeah, early social engagement would be, I think, a great sign of like the quality of a channel, or the likelihood that player is engaged and with you for the ride.
All right, cool. Second to last question here. Do you have any advice for folks listening or watching that are like looking at a sea of data and wondering what matters most? Like anything to like sage advice to help them cut through the mess?
Oh, geez. Let's see. We've talked about a couple of them, but I think that the other things that I think about or talk about the most would be making sure that people can understand it. So that's if it needs 9 caveats and you need to read the SQL query to know what it actually means, it's probably not a good number, even if it's right. I think that's the thing I always stress is like, I'm not telling you you're wrong, that's not that is not the most useful number, but it is not going to be, if other people can't understand it every time and consistently, then it's probably not the number you want to use. So I think that would be a huge piece of the puzzle is what can I kind of explain and have people understand consistently and frequently over time. So that would definitely be probably my number one piece of advice. And I think there are some of us where that's like the hardest thing to hear, because we just want we want to engineer our way to the perfect answer. And sometimes that's not how our small human beings can work.
I love that. I had a boss once tell me, David, if you have to explain your spreadsheet, you built it wrong. So
I love that. That's a simpler way of saying what I just said. But yeah, that's fair.
Oh, awesome.
No, let me tell you all of the great functions I built in the spreadsheet. It's like, no, thanks. I'm all good.
You can't figure it out, then it's not good. Well, this was awesome, Adam. I could talk to you forever about this, but I thought you shared some really cool insights. I really appreciate you joining today. How can folks connect with you online or wherever?
Sure. I mean, certainly, more about my company, go to the website, gamesight.io. I think personally, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can just, search my name and find me by my government name on both places.
I like it. All right. Well, thanks again. Really enjoyed it. Thank you all for listening and watching Growth Stage. Again, this has been your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the digital product community as part of my role here at FastSpring, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here on Growth Stage. Thank you.